Good morning and welcome to the Peace and Justice Report. I'm Tom Walker. Bob Connors is on the alternate weeks, and John Dickman is here to get us set up. We're in a brand new control room, a temporary one, a smaller one, because we're totally renovating the big control room, putting in all new equipment and boards and so forth. I'm really impressed. Should this button be pressed right here? Okay, we're good. So anyway, it's fun around here. We're in a small studio, and we're even my guest is even videotaping this for his blog in this little room. That's going to be fun. And but it's a returning guest. It's always fun to talk to Dr. Philip Travis. Philip is an assistant professor of history at the State College of Florida, Sarasota, Manatee. He holds a PhD from Washington State University. His publications include the 2017 monograph called Reagan's War on Terrorism in Nicaragua, the Outlaw State. And so there are several other peer-reviewed journal articles about U.S. interventionism in Central America and terrorism and counterinsurgency and so forth. So welcome back, Travis.
Thank you, Tom, for having me on. I have to update my bio. I was promoted a while back. I'm actually a full professor now, but, just the titles, But that's my fault for the bio. It needs to be updated there. But
full
thank you
professor.
So much for having me on.
All right. Philip, you have a current series on YouTube and it's called "Breaking the Social Contract: How Americans Lost Trust in the Government." A history of history. What of the series that in your series you call a History Changes series. So that's what we'll talk about today. So tell us, introduce the subject. Well, you say there's a collapse of public trust. I'm not surprised. Can you explain all you mean by this?
Yeah, and I think today, I think a lot of Americans who, regardless of the political side that you're on, whether you're on the left or the right,
okay,
I think that most Americans wouldn't actually be surprised to hear that there is a democratic crisis in the country, or that there is a decline in the public trust. So I want to look at this from a historical standpoint and understand how this happened. And so some of the data that bases this, this is based on Pew Research data. Pew Research data, they collect sort of data from all the major polls, Gallup poll, CBS, that have been conducted over the years. A lot of different metrics involved in these polls to try to establish an understanding of how the public feel about their elected officials, about their government. And so the first thing I looked at was, is this sort of idea, this sense that you have in our greater political body today, is that sense that there is like a decline in public trust, is that actually founded? And when you look at the data, there's no question that, how we might perceive in terms of a loss of public trust is absolutely founded. So the data for the Pew Research Group goes back to the 50s. In particular, I would argue that there's probably something in the way of a new social contract that emerges out of World War II.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
So, in the Enlightenment, the political thinkers of the Enlightenment, of course, the United States, the Republican France, were some of the foremost sort of Enlightenment republics. And Enlightenment thinkers, their sort of focus was trying to find the best sort of form of society, coming out of an age where countries were really dominated by monarchies, birthright monarchy. Enlightenment thinkers were looking for an understanding, a philosophical understanding of the best ways to organize government and society. And many of them engaged in what became known as social contract theory, but it's usually attributed to Thomas Hobbes. And what's meant by that is effectively that in the modern age, when governments are formed, they are based, when they work, they are based on a social contract with the people.
Right. You do this for us, we'll do this for you. Right?
Yeah, and it's something that, it doesn't mean that the government is inherently what we would consider democratic, but it means that effectively the citizens of the state sacrifice certain freedoms, certain things, in exchange for the government protecting their interests, the government providing certain types of services and whatnot. Okay. In democracies, this is based on a number of things, but particularly it's based on a trust in government. And I think that after World War II was this like landmark moment in American history. It was this great victory that Americans very much saw as themselves as the centerpiece of this success, the fight against fascism. Mm-hmm. And in the midst of it, you had the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, really sort of cast the war very much in the spirit of his New Deal before it. Mm-hmm. The idea that the fight against fascism was also a greater fight against inequality, against the threat to, individual freedoms and whatnot. And this was embodied in things like the Atlantic Charter, his Four Freedoms, his State of the Union speech in 1944, which came to be known as the Second Bill of Rights, or the Economic Bill of Rights. Yeah. And so after World War II had ended, you had this, I would argue that you had this expectation of the people in this newfound affluence, this newfound strength, this expectation of the people, a kind of redefining of the social contract, that American leaders would put the public good first. And this would be, it could be, obviously this is a highly complex subject, and what that means is interpretive. It depends on your perspective. However, generally speaking, I think that American leaders, whether they were Republican or Democrat, right or left, would uphold the best interest of society.
Right.
When you look at the data, let me ask you a question, Tom. If you were to guess right now in the 21st century, and I'm not necessarily talking about last week, I'm talking about, say, for the last decade or so, in the 21st century, according to Pew Research data, what do you think the percentage of Americans who will say that they generally have a strong trust, a strong faith in their government, what do you think the percentage would be if you had to guess?
Well, I looked it up last night, but I don't have a good memory. So let's say, I would guess like only a quarter. What is the actual figure?
Yeah, so it's a little bit lower than that. But
wow.
Yeah, so the trend, I would say, for the last decade, according to this data, which again is very reliable data. It is not one sort of poll. It is actually a metric that draws in data from all of the major polls. From Gallup poll to CBS to obviously the Pew Research Group, and so on. For the last decade, you've been hovering really between 18 and 22% trust, strong trust from the public in government.
Right.
So if you went back to the presidency, for example, of Lyndon Johnson, who ultimately becomes even though he made some great contributions in terms of society, right? The Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid. This was Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
Despite that, and particularly for the generations that grew up in the 60s, Johnson, in many respects, became much maligned. What would you imagine would be the public trust in government, approximately,
then?
When LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, took over the presidency?
Right, before Vietnam and things like that. I think it would be higher, maybe 60%.
Yeah, it's actually, you're talking, generally speaking, in the period from Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, and even Johnson into the beginning of the Vietnam War, you're talking about a percentage of the public that asserts a strong faith, a strong trust in their government. You're talking high 70%
wow.
to 80% range.
Wow.
So when you look at this, it's really telling. And when you look at the trend of Pew Research data, there are spikes up. It never comes back to 75, 80%, but there are spikes up. There are trends down to more and less extremes. But overall, what you see when you look at this data is that from that period of the late 1950s and the early 1960s and the height of the Cold War at this time, the United States has since had a consistent trend downward when it comes to the public's faith in government. There have been some periods where there have been like upswings, but overall the trajectory is down. And in the 21st century, once the ramifications of sort of the global war on terrorism and the Bush doctrine in the Middle East sort of begin to take their effect, and people start to sort of take in the ramifications of like the war in Iraq and the basis for the war of Iraq, you have a real consistent, I would say, collapse in the public trust.
So we could say that's deserved in a sense, right? Based on reality.
I think
the Pentagon Papers, so forth, the things that the NSA did,
Yeah, I think so. First of all, what we're looking at today, I imagine that most Americans who are engaged, who are paying attention to their society right now, they would not be surprised to say that there's been a collapse in public trust and that we're in a democratic crisis. In many respects, the feature of the History Changes podcast that I was telling you about, which is titled Breaking the Social Contract, the theme of this is basically the idea that the public trust has collapsed, the social contract is broken, meaning that Americans, and you find on the Democrat side of things, you have a higher percentage. According to Pew Research, you have a higher percentage of Democrats that still kind of hold on to a public trust in their government, as opposed to Republicans, where it's lower. But generally speaking, it's not a partisan thing. There is a widespread sort of collapse in public trust in society, and really, I would argue that the social contract is broken. That effectively, right now, it seems that a critical mass of the American people have effectively rescinded their consent to the contract.
How does that manifest itself in action or in events?
Yeah, so I think, we think about how it manifests itself in realities right now, and I want to go back to, you mentioning Pentagon Papers and NSA. I want to come back to that, but in the short term, so what do we witness, right? I think go back to the 2016 election. The two most popular candidates in the 2016 election, and of course Donald Trump became president, both of those candidates that were the most popular, and I'm referring to Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Right. Not to say that obviously Hillary Clinton had far more support, but in terms of an upswell of like sort of, passionate sort of movement, it was Sanders and it was Trump who were really tapping into this. Both Sanders and Trump really tapped into a narrative that more or less suggested that the status quo, the governing status quo, had fallen woefully short. Yes. In the case of Trump, right, it's a narrative that is really based on a conspiracy. The idea, his narratives, whether it was Build That Wall or it was Hillary Clinton's emails or it was the birther movement with Barack Obama, the Trump position was basically fundamentally, you can't trust the government, the deep state, they're lying to you, they're going against the will of the people. And these were sort of conspiratorial ideas that the government was fundamentally acting. Yes, right. In the case of Bernie, it wasn't so much that he was saying that there were these sort of unfounded conspiracies, but what he was saying is that if you look at, say, for example, the need of Americans to have a living wage job, when you look at the fact that all other wealthy, developed countries in the world have health care for everyone and America doesn't, Bernie Sanders was really criticizing something that was a critique of what he currently describes then as an oligarchy, and in this sense the government was no longer representing the people. So even for Bernie, they have different trains here, but it's not surprising that there were people who voted for Bernie in the primaries, and then when the election came, they either voted for a third party, didn't vote, or there were some of them that even voted for Trump, and that's because this theme, as it was sort of demonstrating itself in America, was that a lot of Americans had lost their faith in the public trust.
Yes, I had people come up to me when I was campaigning for Bernie. They said, I love Trump, but I love Bernie too. That they could love both because they were both breaking out of the mold and saying something's wrong and had something to say about it, what to do about it. So I could see why those guys like both. Yeah.
And so the question, right, was that I'm looking at with this, and it's really complicated, and I want to bring in a lot of specialists as I'm working on this to contribute to it because it's far more complex than my own specialization can do, because it is a really complicated thing. But the idea was really wanted to look at how this happened historically. Where did this come from? It's not as simple, and it's not as simple as the government did this. Some of it occurs because of the government. Other things are because of changes within sort of how society does things. The privatization, for example, of mass media, I think, is a factor.
And the spread of news sources.
Yeah, and the mass information that occurs, which opens the door to all kinds of disinformation and other types of issues.
Right.
So, I do think when you look at the history, and in one respect, I think some people might hear this and they might say, how can we draw a connection with the Vietnam War, given how long ago it was? How do we draw a connection to the Vietnam War and the current sort of condition of the democratic crisis in the United States? But it is really, when you look at the history, the consistent decline in public trust really did have a root in the things that were occurring in the 1960s, particularly surrounding Vietnam, the behavior of the government, and then not after Johnson, of course, with the Nixon administration.
Right.
So I imagine a lot of your listeners are probably very familiar with some of this stuff. But, of course, a critical thing, and when you look at that data, public trust for the government in the United States remains strong. In fact, during all of Lyndon Johnson's presidency,
really?
It's stronger by a long way than it has been in the 21st century, aside from the post 9/11.
Right.
So when you look at the public trust historically, and you see this downward trend, there are these moments where you have these spikes upwards, and you have some moments where there's these big spikes downward. A lot of the spikes upward occur during brief moments of national crisis. So George W. Bush is historically, I think, in the American public, regarded as one of the most negative presidents in people's lifetimes. He's remembered in a very negative sense, George W. Bush, largely because of the recession, also the deception surrounding the war in Iraq, surveillance, these types of things, over the longer term have really hurt the legacy of George W. Bush. However, when 9/11 happened, and in the immediate 2 years after 9/11, George W. Bush was one of the most popular presidents in modern history, and public trust in government had this spike because you had this brief sort of national crisis.
Patriotism, really.
Yeah, and so, and in a way, those brief, as the United States following World War II became a global power, these moments where you had this brief sort of spike in trust in government, despite a consistent descent in terms of how people felt about it, in a way it makes you wonder if that is the government and the American people sort of trying to briefly recapture what they felt at the end of World War II, this great success where the greatest generation had won this crushing victory against fascism and seemingly everything was possible. And in the 40s and 50s, despite the tremendous inequalities that existed in the United States, the question, was America great in the 1950s? Really depends on your perspective, because there were tremendous inequalities. There was widespread repression based on race, gender, sexuality. But on a macro sense, the country was quite affluent. And again, that sort of new contract, the New Deal contract, right? New Deal liberalism, for your listeners, refers to this idea that occurs in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, and the 60s, really, that the government could be a vehicle of positive reform.
Sure.
That the government could use and allocate the wealth of the country to provide Americans with things like a retirement supplement, hence Social Security, with unemployment insurance, that they could provide Americans with ultimately things like Medicare and Medicaid.
And they did.
Yeah, and they did. And this is probably in some ways because of the controversy with Vietnam. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but the great success, and it was far from complete, and far from the vision of Lyndon Johnson, by the way. I think Lyndon Johnson might be the last president. Strangely, he was a Texas Democrat,
right,
which it's hard to imagine a Texas Democrat being president today. But here you have Lyndon Johnson, and his number one campaign goal is not what George W. Bush said when he said, I'm a war president. Lyndon Johnson's number one campaign goal was to eliminate poverty in the United States.
Yes, yes.
And obviously the story of Vietnam is going to overshadow this, but one of the great successes in America in this period of 3 decades was actually some tremendous progress on eliminating poverty in the United States. Medicare is a tremendous success. It might be the most popular next to Social Security program in American history, maybe. And I don't know, I'm sure you remember Shields and Brooks, right? Do you remember the PBS program, Shields and Brooks? And David Brooks is still on it. Of course, Shields has passed, but Brooks was the sort of Republican, and they would have their Friday program. I think it's Brooks and Capehart today. But you would have the Republican and you would have the Democrat. And I remember Shields a few years before he passed on it might have been his last season on that program. And he said that. He said this is like the reduction in poverty in the United States is one of the greatest successes, if not the greatest triumph of the country's history, and we never really even notice it.
Wow. We didn't notice it.
I mean, a lot of people, but it's overshadowed. It's overshadowed, I think, particularly by the thing that really drives the collapse in public trust. And this begins in the 60s and 70s, and that, of course, is the events surrounding the Vietnam War, and also, not without association, but also with the Nixon presidency. So when you get into Vietnam, of course, even in 67, where you have this tremendous protests occurring in the country, open protests in the United States was never a vast majority of Americans. It was a vocal group of Americans, but not a majority of the polity.
Right.
And so even during that period, you had a relatively strong trust in government in the late 60s compared to the 21st century, actually.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, quite impressive. In the low 60%, even in like 1967. And when Nixon was elected, there was hope that Nixon promised peace with honor in Vietnam. Little did Americans know that meant invading Cambodia, attacking Laos, and in terms of ending the war, pretty much doing exactly what Johnson had done. With less regulated bombing, of course, he bombed more intensively in the north as well. But what really when you really start to see the dip, it's really not a dip. It's like it's fallen off the cliff of public trust, at least if you're using the data from the Pew Research Group, which is very reliable data. And this wouldn't surprise anybody, actually, that this would occur, are maybe less the actual events in Vietnam in, say, 67 and 68 in terms of the war, controversial as they may, and those were having an effect, obviously. But the real collapse off the cliff, according to that data, is really with the developments of things like the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah. And
following the Pentagon Papers, the Watergate affair.
Sure.
And why is that? I would say a reason why that was the case really has to do with the fact that in a democratic society, going back to that idea of a social contract, right? So a social contract, Americans or in any society, you give up certain elements of your sort of liberties in exchange for a contract, an agreement with the government that will provide certain protections and promises to the citizenry.
Okay.
In a democratic government, in a social contract that is democratic, the idea of trust in the government is really integral. The idea that your leaders are honest and that they genuinely pursue the public good is really invaluable. And so the Pentagon Papers, which were, of course, released by Daniel Ellsberg in Richard Nixon's first term. He had been a defense contractor. He worked under Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and McNamara had directed the Defense Department to create this report on, basically, it was classified, of effectively the American involvement and experience in the Vietnam War.
Right.
And it's huge for anybody who, it's numerous volumes. I remember when I was a student, and I would love to get lost in college libraries, big college libraries. If you're into history, if you're into learning, I guess so many things are digital now. But when I was coming up as a student, getting lost in a big university library was an amazing thing. And I would come across, 'cause I was always in the history section, you'd come across the voluminous editions of the Pentagon Papers.
Yes.
But of course, the real impact of the Pentagon Papers were the things that were leaked and published in newspapers, like first the Washington Post and then the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And what that conveyed to Americans was that the United States government had misled the American public, if not openly lied about the Vietnam War.
Both.
Yeah. And this was something, it really implicated Kennedy and Johnson the most. It didn't really implicate Richard Nixon, but Richard Nixon, of course, was extremely upset about this, and he would have Daniel Ellsberg's clinic broken into as they tried to dig up dirt on Daniel Ellsberg, his doctor's clinic, trying to dig up dirt on him, trying to smear him, to discredit him. And then, of course, not long after, you have, of course, the Watergate affair in the years following. And, of course, over time, these things all come out, and the dishonesty not only of the U.S. in handling Vietnam, but also the dishonesty of the Nixon administration, its illegal actions.
Right.
Not only lying about things to the public, but also breaking the law. This had a really, really, really crushing effect on public trust.
Right, and it probably has never come back. We know that the government can lie, and we can't believe everything we read, and we know there's secrets. There's secrets within secrets. It's an amazing amount of secrecy, the NSA and so forth. How can we, the citizen says, how can I know? How can I know what's true and what's not true, if that's the case? Yeah,
and in the 1970s, you really kind of, public trust descended to lows almost as low as the 21st century, or at least the last 15 years or so. Not quite that low, though, believe it or not. And probably the 1970s reaction to what had been learned with Watergate, with the Pentagon Papers, but also the decade that might sometimes be maybe inappropriately labeled the malaise decade, following the speech that Jimmy Carter made, that sometimes has become known as the malaise speech, in which Carter told Americans, if your electric bills are too high, maybe or the cost of energy is too much, maybe don't have the air conditioning up so high, or don't have the heat on so high. The speed limits went down to 55 miles an hour. But so the decade of the 1970s then became associated with, in people's minds, it became associated with urban decay. It became associated with lines at the gas stations. It became associated with economic decline in the United States. And so, but the story doesn't end there. There are moments since then where Americans never, in terms of public trust, never regaining sort of the levels that you had in the early Cold War. The idea that the vast majority of Americans trusted their government. But you had, in the 80s and 90s, you had moments where, Americans' trust in government went up. Reagan was a popular president. Clinton was a popular president. During the Clinton years, the economy, relatively speaking, was very strong. It was kind of up and down during the Reaganomics era of the 1980s, but Reagan sort of conveyed things to the American people that inspired people on both the Democrat and Republican side of things.
But he also said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm here from the government and I'm here to help." I think that damaged the whole idea of trusting the government. And it was the president saying so, or candidate.
Yeah, and so, Reagan, he doesn't necessarily go the lengths, say, for example, of like the Trump candidacy, but nonetheless, a lot of Reagan's sort of drive was this anti sort of government drive. The idea, as Reagan said, at the very outset of the 1980s, that never again will our government ask a people to fight and die in a war that our government will not allow them to win. And so, Reagan very much sort of capitalized on the growing sort of loss of public trust in American society.
Public feeling or spirit, and he amplified it, and they voted for him because he gets it.
Yeah, and I think when you look at like the Trump era, obviously it is similar. It is more over the top. It is much more conspiratorial than Reagan. It is different, but there is a similar foundation in terms of the narrative, and that is tapping into this groundswell of a segment of society that have really lost their faith, in their trust in government. Now, behind the scenes with the Reagan administration and also the Clinton administration, there are developments at that time too, however, that while at the time they're not fully appreciated in terms of the ramifications that they have for a loss of public trust, for a democratic crisis. And so today we're in a democratic crisis, and a democratic crisis in the country and a loss of public trust go hand in hand, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a book that's recently come out. I have a published review on this book, actually, coming out in the coming months with the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, and this book is by Alan McPherson, and it's about Iran-Contra. It's called The Breach. It's a great book if anybody wants to really take a real current deep dive into thinking about the Iran-Contra affair.
Even a shallow dive. A lot of people don't even know what that means.
Right. It's an interesting thing because Watergate became this thing where you hear Watergate.
Right.
And it really remained in the public's memory. Like, right. Watergate is something that I think...
Iran-Contra? Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Watergate is the thing that stayed in people's mind. Iran-Contra is this thing that, as illegal actions go from the presidency, as dishonesty go from the presidency, Iran-Contra is right there with Watergate. Like, when you study Iran-Contra, the disregard for the rule of law, when you study Iran-Contra, the open dishonesty is pretty shocking. But yet Iran-Contra did not carry the resonance. It did not hold in the public's memory in the way that Watergate did.
Too complicated. Watergate was a break-in and lying, but the tapes proved him wrong. A simpler scenario. That Iran-Contra was a multi-stage transaction, and it was difficult to follow. And I don't know. I think it's harder to understand.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that when you look at Iran-Contra happens, and you don't have the actual real trials and proceedings until the 90s. It's a different precedent when that stuff's happening.
Right.
And it's not as simple as a break-in. It's not as simple as the president deleted these tapes and then the president's own party said, you got to go.
That's amazing.
Right? Instead, Iran-Contra, it went down into legal speak trials, and it allowed for the media and for politicians to sort of spin and cast this in a different way, and I think Americans really lost their attention to it. But going back to this, so in McPherson, I would say the core of his argument is that a lot of the roots of the modern democratic crisis were actually laid in terms of executive branch violating sort of core principles of separation of powers, of the will of the people, that a lot of these trends were founded in the Iran-Contra crisis.
Okay.
And so you have there's the roots there. Reagan's a very popular president, but yet there's developments behind the scenes that sow the seeds for the modern democratic crisis, and likewise a decline in public trust. And likewise, during the Clinton administration, also a very popular president. Both Clinton and, of course, Reagan both get caught up in, clear dishonesty. But aside from that, right, when Clinton was president, I remember this when I was young. He was a popular president, not from my family because my family was not a Democrat family, but he was a popular president, and the economy was well, and people generally liked Clinton. And he was also, like Reagan, a very, very good speaker. His skills at oratory were very strong.
Yes.
However, and this is one of the interesting things to think about, because today Bill Clinton is so frequently cast as this liberal, and when you actually look at what liberalism means from a social standpoint, Bill Clinton is not. His social policies are not liberal. He's much more of a moderate, if not slightly on the right side of the spectrum. He's a conservative Democrat from Arkansas. And when you compare him to certainly Franklin Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy or even Lyndon Johnson or even the Republican presidents of the New Deal liberal era, it's not nearly as liberal in terms of the overall goals. Instead, you have in the 90s with Clinton, and certainly this is going on with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, you have an increasing movement towards sort of privatization of foreign policy, an increasing openness in terms of how the market may or may not be regulated. And these things will sow the seeds for the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. But in the background of that sort of practice of sort of deregulatory actions, the era from Reagan through Bill Clinton is the era that becomes associated with actions that really decimate the American unions, workers' unions.
Yes.
And so you think about like free trade agreements. I mean, the current era, whether it's Bernie as a candidate or whether it's Donald Trump as a candidate, and whether or not like what either of them were suggesting is the right course of action, because once you have a global system the way it is right now, you like throwing tariffs everywhere is not going to be an immediate fix to that type of thing. However, what those two candidates are tapping into with that is a sense and a perception, particularly from American workers, that the country has betrayed labor. Free trade agreements like NAFTA had huge effects on working people and like union people. I mean, when you look at the last 10 years and you have the so-called blue wall states, states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, these types of places where in previous more recent elections, it was just an accepted fact. Democrats win those states, and Democrats win those states because Democrats are the party that support unions. The legalization of American unions, the legitimization, maybe would be the better word to say that, of American unions, that's New Deal liberalism. That's the Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal. Unions became very, very strong, and while like any large bureaucracies and organizations that can create problems at times, but unions overall, their history of unions, that was the thing that brought workers living wage jobs. That's what created a system where a worker at a manufacturing facility could have a lake house, a boat, and a house and a car. Workers did very well in that period. Well, with the 80s and 90s and sort of increasing push towards deregulatory practices, globalized economic practices, these really undermined workers, and that sowed the seeds for a loss of public trust in government as well. It might not have occurred at that time period, but as the ramifications of those policies for the types of work that existed in the United States, as those types of things really came to fruition in the 21st century, I think a lot of American workers have reacted to that, and it's like the Republicans don't really offer, anything like what, say, for example, New Deal liberals were offering workers. Yeah. But in the last 10 years, they were speaking to them. They weren't offering them union work. They weren't offering them protections for their collective bargaining and these types of things, but they were paying maybe more attention to them. Maybe they had been taken for granted a bit by the mainstream political parties, which no longer. You had now Bernie Sanders is a tremendously strong union politician, but he's also regarded as a fringe in the Democratic world.
Yes.
So you had some strength returned to public trust with Reagan and Clinton, but both of them sort of sowed the seeds for a democratic crisis and an overwhelming decline in public trust in the 21st century.
So do we need public trust? Maybe we should always be suspicious of the government.
If a democracy is going to thrive. Now, it's not to say that, of course, you need to have transparency.
Yes.
Anytime you have any kind of governing organization,
you wish for it.
Yeah, you want transparency. The will of the people, you should have, as long as it is not contradicting, or maybe that's the wrong word, as long as it's not going to, say, put people in harm's way, or something like this, people have a right to know, I think. So you have that right, but if you don't have public trust, mm-hmm. if you don't have a strong enough faith that your leadership in government are acting in the best interest of the public good, then I'm not sure a democracy can really function. I mean, I think you need a critical mass of people. It doesn't mean that that we shouldn't investigate. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't want to know. It doesn't mean that there won't be corruption, because corruption happens. Those things should happen. But you need to have a robust trust in government for a democracy to thrive. And I guess what I want to say to your point, having public trust in government does not mean don't pay attention to what they're doing. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned that there could be things occurring in your name as a citizen of this country that are not in the interest of the public good. No, you should pay attention to that.
Right.
But and we need to have good, clear information so that we as citizens can be educated voters. We can be informed voters. Maybe it's a better word.
That's the key. Good information.
Right.
That's another problem.
Yeah. But there has to be a sort of, if you're going to have democracy thrive and exist and be healthy and provide the sort of freedoms and rights that Americans have become very accustomed to, there will have to be a leadership in the United States ultimately that is able to regain public trust. Not that means you close your eyes and we're no longer going to worry about any of this stuff anymore, but that the people trust that the best interest of the country are at heart.
And how would they go about finding that trust? What would make people want to give that kind of trust?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Right now, that's a big challenge for society. As a historian, I think educating people in history and doing our best to teach critical thinking, information, mass information, disinformation, the types of information that is available and consumed en masse, I think is very challenging today. You have to be a real critical thinker because there's so much information coming at you from so many different sides.
Right.
And that's a challenge. And I think recovering, because we're in a democratic crisis right now. When we say we're in a democratic crisis, that's not to say. And I suppose part of this is my opinion. Obviously, much of this is my opinion, though many of these are all historical facts here. But I think if you look at the Pew Research data about public trust in government, and you look at its collapse, I think when you think about the idea that the social contract is broken, is failing, that's a serious crisis of democracy. That's something that we should be very concerned about. That's a situation that could pose like very significant ramifications in terms of the things that we champion, in terms of liberties in the country, in terms of our freedoms in the country, the right to free speech, a myriad of types of things that could be threatened if we're not able to recapture this public trust and democratic system.
If we don't have that, maybe we turn to a strong man or to somebody with seemingly all the answers, or give up our own questioning, or give up our role as citizens, just in the hopes that he or she would be a savior of sorts. It's not healthy, of course, but there's so many sources of information. Just simply to choose among them is a daunting task. And I read Heather Cox Richardson every morning. She's a good historian.
Yep.
When your students come in, how much of this history do they know, or do you find them not so knowledgeable?
Well, I have some really, really great students who have a really, really excellent historical understanding, but most of my students are introductory level students.
Right.
And so we're in the process of sort of learning a lot of this stuff. But my young people, my students, they give me a lot of hope in terms of solving the democratic crisis. Now, it's not a solution that's going to happen, in the very, very near future. But the students that I teach give me a lot of hope for finding a path forward in terms of the democratic crisis, in terms of public trust, in terms of having a government that places the public good above more self-interest or specific aims.
When you tell them about something new, like the Pentagon Papers or the Iran-Contra affair, they still have hope. They still, understanding that there can be flaws and hidden secrets and so forth, they still have hope for the best, so to speak, or a better system. Or are they cynical?
It's a mix. It's a mix in terms of, I think there's some who have hope. I think there's some who are very cynical. I think there are some that are not as engaged with it, but there's enough of them that are thinking and really considering their world from a historical standpoint, considering how they understand, what the core ideas behind the United States are. And the core ideas behind the United States are the idea that all people should, be treated equally before the law. The idea that you have a right to assemble. The idea that you have, protections from illegal searches and seizures, and so forth. The core ideas that you're a citizen, and as part of the citizen, you are a direct, engaged participant in the overall governing apparatus. That you have a right to have a say, that you should have a say, and that doesn't mean you always get your way. But I think they really appreciate this core idea, and so I think that, like, when you talk about, for example, when you talk with young people and you explain to them that, Richard Nixon was interviewed after his presidency, a famous interview, and when asked about illegal actions that occurred, Richard Nixon effectively said, when the president does it, it's not illegal.
I've heard that before.
Yes. And so when students hear that, they're like, wow, they can't believe that a president would say that, because how you think about the core ideas, the core values of the United States, that's just...
but Trump says the same thing, right?
So the thing with then when you turn that around and you say, what if I told you that the Supreme Court ultimately would basically agree with them, with Nixon? Mm-hmm. And that's the Trump versus United States case, in which the Supreme Court in 2024 made the argument. I think it was a 6-3 decision along party sort of lines, shouldn't be party lines, but yes. A 6-3 decision, I believe it was, in which the Supreme Court argued that if actions are conducted in an official capacity, again, what an official capacity is That's a matter of debate.
Yep.
But if actions are committed in a official capacity, that effectively the president was above the law. And so you explain that, and students are shocked by that, and I don't think that my general sense is that young people hear that and they're like, well, that's not right. Everyone's supposed to be equal before the law.
Yeah.
And I don't think any American historian believes that George Washington or the founders in the country, because so oftentimes in the United States, political figures will hearken back to these founders, and I think you'd be really hard-pressed to find an American historian that would say that George Washington thought that he was above the law. I actually think that his behavior as the first president of the United States was demonstrative of the idea that he didn't believe that.
Yes, of course.
But so we are in a very important time in history. I don't think in every sense it's unprecedented, but we are in a very, very concerning time in the country right now. I think the social contract has broken down. As a historian, I'm trying to bring in as many not only historians, but also people like yourself, concerned citizens, start thinking about how this breakdown in the social contract occurred. How did a collapse in public trust occur? What has led to the people basically removing their consent? Because that is effectively what has happened in the United States, and that's really what was behind, in my opinion, that's behind what made Bernie such a strong candidate, and that's what made Donald Trump.
Removing their consent. What do you mean?
So in the democratic social contract, the idea being that the governed consent as part of this agreement. We consent to this governing system.
We've removed that?
I think that the Trump era is evidence that Americans have declined their consent to the contract as it existed sort of from World War II into the early 21st century. And I think the popularity of the Bernie Sanders candidacy and him as a personality also indicate that. It's a suggestion that Americans no longer believe that the center, if you will, that the status quo governing sort of apparatus in the country is working for the public good. It doesn't mean that the choices there are working for the public good, but it means that people are voting, for example, in the case of Donald Trump, you're voting for a candidate whose effectively entire mantra is that the government can't be trusted and there are all these conspiracies.
That would include his.
There are all these conspiracies, right?
Right.
Whether it's, going back to Obama and the birther movement or Hillary Clinton's emails or Hunter Biden's laptop or they go on and on and on about the various conspiracies, right? Or it's Bernie Sanders who's saying not really conspiracies. He's really referring to like labor and economic facts that scholars like Robert Reich, for example, Bill Clinton's first labor secretary, has written works on this and discussed this type of stuff widely. And these are facts that in terms of working people, conditions for working people have declined. Conditions for those seeking to organize as unions, to collectively bargain for better wages, has fallen under a level of attack that it hasn't seen since 100 years ago, since the Gilded Age period in American history even. Workers are under attack. There is increasing stratification of the country in terms of those who have and those who don't have. And so, it was Jimmy Carter who referred to the United States first as potentially an oligarchy following the Citizens United decision. And, that's what Bernie Sanders is tapping into.
Well, why aren't the unions and the workers fighting back a little more instead of somehow following Trump? Why aren't they fighting back for their rights?
Why are they?
Why are they not?
Well, some are. It's like, there are, but it's hard. It's really difficult for a lot of unions if a state can pass right to work laws. Right to work laws can be very, very restrictive and difficult for unions. In the state of Florida, for example, you have a constitutional right in the state of Florida, according to the Florida Constitution, to be able to form a union. But in the last decade or so, there's been a lot of policies put in place that, basically trying to make labor organizing very, very difficult. It used to be that for a union, say like a teachers union or something like this to exist, you needed 50% membership.
Right.
Well, it's been increased to 60% membership.
Right.
Then you have all of these requirements that the state has you fulfill, and if you don't fulfill them, then they audit you, and then they force you to like start over again. And that's the case here. But I think it's become very difficult for labor to organize, and you do still have a lot of labor organization, but when you go to like a right to work state and you have a place like Boeing in South Carolina that forms its its basis there and does so largely on the basis that you're not going to have unions there. Forming a union in that political context is very difficult. It's not impossible. Like you've seen union efforts come up from even the likes of like Starbucks, for example. And we've had some high profile labor strikes and whatnot. However, it's very difficult because there's not a robust political support for labor unions like there was in, say, the age of New Deal liberalism.
Right.
I mean, you think about so the Biden administration was much, much better for labor and unions than the Trump administration is, or any Republican administration, since the 1980s. But even the Biden administration stopped short of like robustly sort of supporting unions in the way that you might have found with a Franklin Roosevelt or a Lyndon Johnson or and so on. So it's hard, and labor's really found itself to fall under a lot of attack, and that's part of the breakdown in public trust and the breaking of the social contract.
Well, there you go. We've been talking to Professor Philip Travis, full professor of history at the State College of Florida, and his series on YouTube is called Breaking the Social Contract, How Americans Lost Trust in Government, A History of Changes podcast. And you can find that on YouTube. I hope you're doing. Thank you, Philip, for being this podcast. You can find that on YouTube. I hope you're doing. Thank you, Philip, for being here again, and keep us informed.
Absolutely.
We need to know more. We need to know more about our history. Stay tuned.